Thanks for the nice introduction. I'm here as a representative, as a non-STEM person. I have a finance background. I'm here to talk about careers in finance that help STEM and innovation get into the marketplace. So this is basically the intersection of science and business. Um, as was mentioned, I have my career's been in finance. My specialty is financial planning and analysis, and I've worked for Mars Inc. For 29 years, very large, privately held consumer packaged goods company. You've heard of their products: M&M's, Snickers, Three Musketeers. First or second biggest candy company in the world. It's also the first or second biggest pet food company in the world: Pedigree, Whiskas, Caesar, Sheba. And then it has a small food business, Uncle Ben's Rice here. I worked for years on Seeds of Change, which is organic food and organic seed. So I was lucky to have a nice, long, and interesting career there. And so I want to talk about how it's great to have a great idea through like innovation, through R&D, through STEM, but how do you go beyond a great idea? How do you take that idea and make it marketable? And to do that, you need a number of things. You need these elements. You need a strategic vision. You need to develop a supply chain to get the good or product into the marketplace. You need marketing to create demand and sales to create customers to be able to distribute your products either online or in bricks and mortar format. And then that marketing needs to reach consumers to go to the customers. Overall, you need people to run your company. And then back to R&D, it's not just R&D to get the product off the ground. You need to continually innovate. What you need is a business plan. And so a business plan takes all these elements. It takes the idea, the innovation. It's wrapped around a strategy. You put it together with a team, and you start to run a project where the ultimate goal is to generate sales and profit to keep the business thriving, or in some cases to keep it surviving if it's a very competitive framework. But that's to get the initial idea off the ground. What you really have to focus on is then continual innovation, where you're maintaining that existing supply chain and product portfolio, and you also need to enhance it with line extensions, and you also need to develop new products. And the same applies to the supply chain. You have to periodically look at the supply chain and make sure the way you get that product in the marketplace is competitive and efficient. Essentially, this is where the majority of people that work in organizations in a STEM capacity are spending their time on continual innovation. Not on the startup. Once that's a small team getting into the marketplace, then the bigger organization has to take it off and then continually innovate. This innovation is done within an innovation cycle where, it starts with research. You look at, is this something that already exists with a patent? You make your first stab at financially assessing, is this make sense? We don't have all the details yet, but, with the data we have, is this something that's going to cost $100 to make and the marketplace is only willing to spend 10? So we better shut down at this stage before continuing and developing the product, getting a patent, developing the marketing plan, licensing if necessary, but commercializing it, getting into the supply chain, getting it out there, and then generating revenue. And then you start all over again. What happens when you don't have a good business plan? You get companies that don't make it 10 years, like MoviePass, Quibi, Pets.com. Great ideas, but they were missing a couple elements in the supply chain. MoviePass, for instance, just thought that they were going to be able to negotiate lower prices from the movie theaters, as well as they were going to get kickbacks from the movie theaters because people that use MoviePass were buying a lot more concessions. They didn't get it. They went out of business. What happens when you don't have continual innovation? your Sears. They're not out of business yet, but after 100 something years, they're on life support. Blockbuster, obviously, lost out to Netflix, Redbox, did not stay relevant. And then there's still circuses, but the circus was Ringling Brothers, and they were around 150 years, and now they're gone. So who creates business plans? MBAs, Masters of Business Administration. Now, a lot of us think of MBAs and we think of these the greedy CEO, the greedy the investment bankers, unethical prep people that wind up in jail. And yes, these people do exist, and they've created some pretty bad problems in the past. Um, you know, two recessions, the last one being the Great Recession 2007, was investment bankers who created the markets, housing market and the financial market collapsed because of subprime mortgages, which were caused by unregulated derivatives, financial things that they created, and they were out of control. Before that, the dot-com bust bubble of the 90s, that was generated a lot too by just greed, just getting as much money as they could for their businesses, and not really having the right end strategy where the company would ever be financially viable. And if you go back to the 80s, junk bonds were created. But really, an MBA is a lot more than that. If you look at the core curriculum of an MBA, it consists of marketing, ethics, accounting, organizational behavior, which is growing and maintaining an organization, quantitative analysis, that's management science, finance, both how do you get money to grow your company, but how do you make the right decisions? And that's where financial planning and analysis, which is something we're going to spend a lot of time talking about, comes in. Operations, how do we run the supply chain? Economics, so you understand how your business is going to be impacted by the economy, or vice versa. And then strategy. And by the way, a lot of these fields are sciences. You earn BS degrees, Bachelor's of Science degrees, in accounting, in undergraduate, or master's degrees in quantitative analysis, in finance, in operations, and economics. Now, bear in mind, an MBA, you're going to take one or two classes in each of these fields. So you're not going to be an expert like in most master's degrees. And you're going to get the ability to maybe hone in and take 3 or 4 in one of these fields and specialize. But it's really important to be a generalist and understand the big picture of how a business works. What are the kind of jobs that these give you in corporations? Well, marketers become brand managers. Accountants are accounting managers. The controller function is part of that. Organizational behavior is human resources, but it's also senior managers need to be well steeped in this. Your management scientists do quantitative analysis. Finance, we talked about, yes, we have to get money. We have to issue stock and borrow money with bonds and bank financing, but it's also doing that financial planning and analysis. Operations is managing the supply chain. And economics is more, unless you're a big company, you're not going to have an on-site economist, but your corporate planners and your senior managers have to understand what's going on in the economy and have a firm understanding of economic concepts. And if you're lucky to have a concept of you got to avoid becoming a monopoly, otherwise you'll have the feds breathing down your throat. And then strategy is senior management. And once again, your FP&A people are well steeped in strategy. Everyone should be practicing ethics. The problem is, like when I got my MBA, ethics was not even a class. Now in most MBAs, it's required at least one class to understand ethics, so that we don't get in this maintain this position where like the average CEO makes 500 times more than the lowest level employee. That might be a little bit overkill unless that CEO is Steve Jobs, who had a magic touch. Not most CEOs are not that powerful where they really earn 500 times more than the average person. Now, with the continual innovation, I want to talk more about that because this is crucial to profitable growth. Once again, it's the more common area where we're going to spend our time. It's very team oriented and project based. So you'll be have to be a good team worker, be good at project management, or at least working with the project managers to make sure you're not hurting the project because you're behind. These are really the more interesting jobs in the day-to-day aspects of most jobs in corporate America. Even like a sales job might be fascinating, but most salespeople, you're getting the new innovative products that R&D and marketing are bringing out with your input, but then you're just, making your calls to the same customers. You might get lucky and need to find new customers for, new products. But even something that looks as fascinating as sales, it's more of a day-to-day. You're the general accounting manager, or your accounts receivable collecting money. You're doing kind of the same thing day in and day out. And you'll see in a minute the different things that go on in this innovation, why there's so many different things that need to happen and why it makes it very fascinating. The other good thing is that everyone needs to know what everyone else on these projects teams do. So you get to know how other departments function, but nobody more than the FP&A person and the project manager. What's FP&A? I said it before, financial planning and analysis. So it's part of the finance team, and the FP&A these are people that help co-pilot the business with senior management. Most people think of finance as accountants who are the custodians of the business. Their job is to protect the business assets. It's cash account, it's accounts receivable to collect money, it's inventories, and it's fixed assets to make sure we're putting in the right factories and expanding our offices correctly, and we're not abusing them. That co-pilot job is where FP&A comes into play, where you're helping make sure that the business's decisions they're making are financially solid. It's a very strategic role. You're among the first people to see what's going to go happen in the company because you're working on 1 year and 5-year strategic plans. And the cool part is you're performing these analyses that justify corporate initiatives. What are we talking about when we talk about corporate initiatives? Well, it's everywhere from that, enhancing your current product line, launching new products, making major capital investments like a new multi-million-dollar line in a factory or building a new factory. It's also looking at should you acquire a competitor to get a brand that will help your company's portfolio, or maybe you want their assets because you need capacity, or they have some technological innovations. And the mergers does the combination of merging with another company make the sum of the parts greater than the whole, just to make you even, $200 billion companies becomes a $300 billion company because of all the synergies they have. It's also smaller things like line extensions, coming out with the next varieties of a product line, and paying close attention to pricing, so deciding when you need to make price increases and how much, or how to react to competitive pricing, and also marketing campaigns. It's additionally, it's looking at the ongoing capital investment, even like the factories, once they're built, they need to continue to expand. Offices need to get bigger, or maybe move to another location. So it's helping analyze those. It's managing supply chain strategies. There's operations people managing the supply chain, but helping analyze, do we have the right strategy in place? And I'm gonna go through the remainder of the presentation looking at an actual example of what that looks like. And it's also not so happy things like plant shutdowns and product discontinuations. And then finally, it's a lot of financial statements analysis and building 1 year and 5-year plans. Now, I've been fortunate that I was able to use my MBA and do all of these things multiple times in my career. So you talk about going to work every day and your job looks different every day. When you're in a job like that, that's an added benefit. Or an added source of stress. I want to talk about Mars's pet food, dry pet food strategy, that proposition I ran in 1998 for the next 10 minutes to give you an example of financial planning analysis and a supply strategy. So to start off, like some of the background, Mars had seen tremendous growth in dry pet food. They were already a strong wet pet food company, canned pet food, and not too strong in dry, but they saw tremendous growth in the 90s. And Mars also had a fixed assets management strategy. How do we invest in factories and offices? And their strategy has always been, we build mega factories, large factories. We run them 24/7. And we get as much sales out of that factory as possible. And we buy the biggest and best technology. And we automate like crazy. So that's going to be important how they got into the dry strategy down the road. And the thing is, this strategy, this manufacturing fixed asset strategy, served them well in wet pet food and candy. Um, 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 it served them well, but with dry pet food, after going from $100 million in sales to $1 billion, the profit margins were still low. Why was this? Well, to understand it, we got to look at the history of Mars. Started as a candy company in 1900. They started out with Fill Bars. Three Musketeers was their first product, and Milky Way. Then Snickers, ultimately in the 40s, that became the biggest seller. But they started out with one factory in Chicago and grew it quickly to be a large factory. Eventually expanded it to another factory, and then got into convenience chocolate, which is M&M's, in the 40s with one big factory in New Jersey, and which was making all the M&Ms for the whole world initially, and then built another one in the States and more around the world. And as a result, Mars is the number 1 or 2 candy company in the United States since the 40s, and it has like over a 30 share of the market. And it did this with building really large factories. And when they needed to expand, they built a second large factory. Pet food was kind of different. They got into pet food. It was really a story of the founder, Frank Mars, was annoyed with his son, Forrest Sr. So he said, why don't you do something instead of bugging me? Go to England and invent canned pet food. So he did, and it was a market that really did not exist. People either fed their working dogs and alley cats table scraps, or they pampered. These are the original people who pampered their pets. They went to the butcher shop every couple of days to buy food for themselves, and they picked up a pound of liver, cooked it, chopped it up, and gave it to their pet. So Mars learned by launching wet pet food, the more higher quality and more expensive, the more they grew the market. And they quickly became number 1, being first on the block in England, expanded to France, Germany, and the rest of Europe, and then Australia, where by the 50s, they had achieved number 1 with over 50 market share. Then they needed to get in the States, so they went and bought a business, Calcan, in 1968. They grew it quickly, built a second cannery in Columbus, Ohio in the 70s, and then decided to get into dry. And when they went into dry, they thought, with pet food, just like candy, large, giant factories are much more efficient than small ones. So they built giant factories to do it. They use that same strategy with pet food, with dry pet food. They decided, let's build one factory in the middle of the country, and that should work well for us. And they built that, and then before they could expand, the business grew. When the business started growing, they couldn't expand fast enough, so they used contract manufacturers because their biggest customers use those same contract manufacturers. The biggest customers like Walmart and Costco, when they make their own brands, Old Roy and Kirkland, they don't have their own factories. They hire a contract manufacturer. So let's look at the economies of scale of candy and pet food to understand why those economies of scale didn't work for dry pet food. Economies of scales are described like the proportion of savings and cost that are gained as you increase the level of production. So you can see here, this is an example of candy. Now, these numbers are coming from my recollection, but even if I had the good numbers, I would need to change them anyway to protect the innocent. But typically in the candy business, a small factory would be 20,000 metric tons. A large factory would be 3 times that size. And then a mega factory would be 150,000 metric tons per year. You can see the selling price per metric ton, that's 2,200 pounds of candy, is pretty good at $2,500. It's got a high raw material cost, mostly in raw materials, not so much packaging, high quality ingredients. And you can see the example of economies of scale. As you go from a small to a large factory, look at the savings you get. You get a 50% savings in your manufacturing cost. Once you get to that 75,000 tons, not so much. If you looked at this for like the car industry, this would be, a couple $100 million factory to start building like a limited capacity $150,000 sports car. Would cost you, $50,000 a car to make. When you're building a General Motors or a Toyota plant, you're getting the cost down to $5,000 a car. So you need to about build $1 billion, $2 billion factory. So with Mars, with candy, the result was that they stuck at the 75,000 tons factories over time, because to save that, the savings of $25 to expand the existing factory were more than offset in savings in logistics by going to a second site, save $50. So you get a situation where, you've got that sweet spot, 42% gross margins. Gross margins are basically your variable profitability. For every dollar more in sales, you would basically get 42 cents more in profit. So in the consumer packaged goods world, 35 plus is a really good number. So Mars had an extra demand that they really wanted to have something close to 40. Canned wet pet food is similar. Large factories are better, but mega factories aren't necessarily good. So the first thing you notice though is the sales per ton is on like half. So candy is worth a lot more than wet pet food. Material costs are less, but in truth, the material costs are, the can costs more than the stuff that's in it. So the value to the consumer really is that stuff, the stuff to the pet, the stuff inside. So it's not really, it might be $150 to $200 a ton. Now you look at the manufacturing costs, huge benefit when you come down to the giant factory. To get to the super giant factory, not so much. And then logistics, it's lower because you can sell more on full trucks and of pet food than candy. And a lot of candy, chocolate, you have to refrigerate. But you can see here, the big benefit is going to that second plant, not so much to the third. And once again, that sweet spot here, one medium-sized factory with two sites spread out along the country, 40% margin, which is where Mars wound up with the two factories. Now, dry pet food, Mars did not do this when they got into dry. They just said 50, 75,000 ton factories seem to be the right size for candy. And for wet pet food, let's do it for dry. And you can see with dry, once again, the sales is even half. The sales value is half of wet pet food. It's a fourth of candy. That stuff's not, worth a lot of money. A full truck of this, and a full truck, you can't like fill it up to 48,000 pounds. It's too bulky. Is only worth like $20,000. A full truck of candy is worth 100,000 more. The materials are relatively cheap, and the manufacturing cost is the interesting thing. This is the economies of scales are a small factory is almost as efficient as a medium factory or a jumbo factory, where the real benefit is getting to 3 sites as quickly as possible. So Mars did the worst of all worlds. Initially, they started out with a giant factory in one site, 25% profit margins. And that's what I described as they grew from 100 million to a billion. how come we're not making any money? So they had already figured out they had to wrestle away um, capacity from the contract manufacturers. And you think, well, what do you mean you have to wrestle away? Just build a factory and tell the contract manufacturers you don't need it. In this case, the contract manufacturers already made Walmart and Kirkland products, Walmart and Costco products. So Walmart and Costco said, why don't you make your products there? So when we pull our trucks up to pick it up, their distribution centers are close to ours. These contract manufacturers built their factories near the DCs of these large companies, and that saves you money. I mean, it costs you a little bit more money to use them, but you'll save a ton of money in logistics and give us a price break, and we'll pass that on to the consumer. And that's what drove sales. So when we wanted to take that, repatriate that capacity, it was tough. We ultimately were able to build three 75,000 ton factories and get to this 3 site space. So we got the margins up very healthy to 43%, competitive with candy and wet pet food. Um, but the dry pet food strategy said expand as quickly as you can, but focus on smaller plants. Try to get closer to your marketplace, and this is a strategy that works with bottlers. Originally Coca-Cola was in bottles, so they made the syrup in Atlanta. Then they would ship it to bottlers in all major cities, and then the bottlers would buy glass locally, bring water in, add it to the syrup, and then they'd have a bottling plant in LA to distribute to LA, one in San Francisco, one in the Pacific Northwest. They'd have 20 bottlers across the country because it's just you're moving water and glass. It's just super expensive. You go with smaller bottlers closer to customers. Post-mortem of this was that, inspired by this, in 2005, Mars bought that contract manufacturer and merged it with their existing business. They picked up 12 additional plants into the network. So they got to, wow, we're going to get really close to the customers. Unfortunately, 12 is overkill. You start getting something called diminishing marginal returns. So you can see here, every plant you add adds a little, the savings go down. Here you save 60, here you save 50. When you get to like a 4th site, you're down to 85, whatever. And it doesn't change dramatically the further you go. So they added these 12 plants, and it was overkill. And they shut down half of them over time. And a lot of these plants really weren't that efficient anyway. They were poorly run, and it was easier to shut them down and to try to teach them to run correctly. And that post-mortem looked like this. There was there were more 25,000 ton factories in the system than there were 75,000 tons, and the extra logistics didn't really get so much. So it didn't hurt the profit margins that much, but they had really optimized it at getting to 3 sites. So I want to conclude this before Q&A just by talking about, if you're interested in corporate, in finance, and in particular FP&A, how do you integrate that into STEM education? And one way is in undergrad. You could, focus on getting a BS degree. You can use your interest in science and go right into business. But if you were going to do that, you would think, let me get a BS degree, where it would be in accounting or finance, FP&A, not investment banking, operations, research or management science. But probably better would be either the double major, have your STEM degree and get a minor or another major in whatever the school offers. If it's a UC, they'll offer economics. Not ideal, but it's still a science. The truth is, though, I always had a fascination in STEM, and I was able to use that fascination in science to put my 2 cents in. Last year at this conference, I talked about an initiative I worked on, mostly with a veterinarian, where we developed a model for a custom dog food. I also was able to build a prototype, design a frozen food factory that put the frozen food in a bag, versus most frozen food you buy. It's a tray or a bowl. Mars did not have a frozen food factory at the time. They used contract manufacturers, and they weren't sure if they were going to stay in the frozen food business. I'm talking about Uncle Ben's sold frozen food through the 2000s. Ultimately, they left it, but we decided, hey, if you can put it in a bowl where you have to, there's a little neighbor attention, you got to scoop, getting people to scoop in rice, scoop in chicken, scoop in vegetables, squirt on sauce. Maybe a machine puts the lid on, but then, people had to put it in a box and put it together. Mars was not going to do that. They would have built a highly automated factory, and that would have been expensive, 50, $100 million. But if you could put all the components in a bag, you could staff it relatively light. So, as a finance guy, I was able to work on STEM stuff in my career without being a scientist. But ultimately, I'd say get your STEM degree, study some business, maybe a minor, but and then go to work and see if you like what you're doing. And if you like working on project teams and you like what the finance people do, and then think about getting your MBA. And when you get into your second year, you can specialize and go for one of these science programs. Or you might start just to see if it'd be interesting in what that you learn. This is a great book that I've given out to 10 people. I mentor at Cal State Long Beach seniors of the College of Business, and I always give them this book and say, don't rush out and get your MBA, work for a while and read this, spend 20 bucks on this book, and you can literally read it in 10 days. And it goes through all those fields where you have to learn something. That might help you decide if you really want to invest the 2 years and the $100,000 if your company's not going to pay for it into getting the master's. Before I turn it over to Q&A, I just wanted to stress, the importance of a STEM education. The U.S. just 20 years ago, the U.S. led the world in primary education in STEM, and now we're basically in the middle of that. Yet, our higher education, our colleges and universities, we are among the best in the world, and we bring in people from other countries to our colleges and universities to learn STEM because we do it so well. So we should. It's excellent that you guys are really fascinated in this. And it's really important in our future because the whole future of the world was dictated largely by innovation and technology, which is what STEM is all about. So good luck with that. And that said, I'd love to talk and take any questions and answers with the time allotted.
I guess I can start with a question. I wanted to ask, how did you get into this field and why did you decide to stay in this field?
So when I went to college, I was the first kid of a family of 8 kids that was going to go to college, and I was going to pay my own way. So I decided I'm going to study something practical. I was going to study business. And truthfully, that first accounting class I took, I just had a knack for it. Accounting, this is before Sudoku, but for me, accounting was like doing Sudoku. You've got some of the answers and you get, with math and logic, you can fill in the rest. So it was like puzzles. So I was really fascinated by it and good at it. I knew I wasn't going to be an accountant, but accounting is like the language of the business. So once you can understand how accounting works and read financial statements, it opens the door. And most of my jobs, I've worked very few jobs where I was a low-level accountant. I was like CFOs or controllers, but not generally a general accounting manager or anything. Most of my jobs were in planning. And once I got into planning, it was just so fascinating that, wow, you're looking at initiatives before the rest of the business. The marketers and R&D and senior managers are looking at it, and you got to have 2 cents early on. And I just loved, when Excel didn't exist when I started college, and once like the first spreadsheets were Lotus 1, 2, 3. And when I saw that a year or two into my career, it was like, this talks to me. This is just like so fun to work on spreadsheets. So the fact that I was creating things, I was in the creative process And sometimes I got to like be with the scientists on it, but for the most part, I was able to help guide them to do the right thing financially, and to put my 2 cents into, product design and things like that. So that's what kept me in it. Right now, I'm working on with a company. We want to start up a candy company, which does sound exciting, but the whole business model is we want to hire only disabled vets. So we'd have this very labor intensive business, but it would be with disabled vets, and we'd bring these people back together in a team environment that they were used to in the military. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it did. I kind of want to expand on that. Kind of like, what tips would you give to start businesses or like entrepreneurs that want to start up their business? Kind of like with the candy company.
Yeah, you heard from the last speakers. The time investment is so huge. Um, uh, in that. And you hear about the success stories, the guys that come out of it. Even like modest success could be 500,000 in stock options from a small company, but millions and millions of dollars. So the key is you have to know, do you have that risk taker ability? Do you have that entrepreneurial spirit, and are you young enough to do it? Because as studies have shown, as we age and get more education, our risk aversion increases exponentially. When you're 22 with a bachelor's degree with no house payment and no spouse or children to support, you're willing to like roll the dice. Once you hit 30, you've had a couple of years in a corporate job, 6 figures, spouse, a couple of kids, house payment, you're a lot likely to take the big chances. So do it young and prepare to fail, more than once. One of the guys I worked with at Mars, John Foley, he had been working at Mars 10 years. He transferred to Los Angeles, and the dot com boom was starting, and he went to a couple dot coms, and he picked good ones, but not the right ones. He was on Nook when Amazon launched Kindle, so he ran Nook, and it looks okay, but it's 5% of the market share. Ultimately, though, he found something he was passionate about, and he founded Peloton. So now he's the founder of Peloton, multi-billionaire. And, people who ride Pelotons, it's like a life experience. It's changed their life. So he's stuck with it. Even then, after he was married with kids, he was in Manhattan at the time, so he might not have had a house. But it wasn't until he was like 40s where he hit it big. So you have to also have that willingness, determination to try again. Did that answer your question?
Yes, it did. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I guess as another question is, what do you think is the biggest challenge that plagues like the field that you work at? So for like giving financial assistance, what do you think is the biggest challenge to that?
Yeah. The two biggest challenges are that perception of the finance people as, Mr. Monopoly, or the greedy, Bernie Madoff, or Michael Milken, the junk bond creator, these greedy guys that are just creating stuff to get rich, and they don't care if it hurts other people or the world economy in general. And as you saw by the curriculum of an MBA, no, it's much more rounded than that. So that's one. The other one is the job I obviously did felt more like a consulting job within the company. And the truth is, a lot of companies hire consultants. They hire the McKinseys of the world to do that kind of thing. And consulting companies have gotten a really bad rap over the last couple of dozen years, starting with like Arthur Andersen, which is one of the biggest ones. And they were also, companies hired Arthur Andersen to audit their books to make sure that they were sound. And they were also hiring them to give them advice. So they had a conflict of interest, and it showed, and they went out of business in both camps. McKinsey's having a problem, with their corporate vision. They charge a lot of money. They come in, they give you advice, and then they leave. And then a lot of times, if it doesn't work, the assumption is, well, those guys from McKinsey are geniuses. It must be us. We must have done it wrong. a lot of people understand, maybe you should develop the expertise within versus hiring consultants to tell you. So those are the biggest challenges, is getting companies committed to investing in their FP&A. And even like very large companies, I did a project with the UPS store. Now the UPS store was mailboxes, etc. They were bought by UPS in the late 90s, and UPS didn't let them sit and grow on their own. No doubt UPS has a lot of FP&A. UPS store had none. So when their marketing company wanted to work with them to try to actually grow their business, and it was growing like 5 to 10% a year with them doing nothing. The idea was, if we can do um, tactics, maybe we could double that growth. They had nobody. So the UPS store. So I went and consulted with their marketing consultants, to help them develop financial models. And it was like amazing. They were like, the last meeting we had with them was just me and their finance people, because their finance people were mostly accountants, custodial people. And they were just like, wow, you can do this stuff? Like, I wanted to know, will you give me a financial statement of what, the average UPS store franchisee has? And they were like, oh, we really can't. So I said, well, I'm going to guess at it, because I'm going to use that to see what the value of all these things we're going to do. And when I handed it to them, they were amazed, like, this is really close. How did you know? Like, the average UPS store franchisee brings in 300 grand and makes 50 grand profit. And it was like, just educated guesses, you just need a little bit, some data points, Sudoku, fill in the blanks. So it's greedy MBAs, greedy people in general, and the bad rap on consultants is like, could be a debt.
Right. Then I guess for one last question, this is just like a curiosity question. Gabriel asked, if you're advising two businesses that are in the same industry, how would you deal with competition?
What was the
If you
first part of that? The two
if
businesses?
you're working with like two businesses that are like in the same industry as each other, how would you deal with competition between the two
So if you're
businesses?
saying you're consulting with two.
Yeah.
Yeah, so generally, I would guess like that doesn't happen that much, because there's a lot of non-disclosures, and when they find out, they might go, oh, so if I'm UPS and I want to hire a consultant, it would look good that, oh, this consulting firm did some work for Federal Express, but they're not working with them now, so it's like, oh, good, maybe they'll give me some of that, what they learned from that, to help me. But I think generally you wouldn't have a high level consultant that would be working on with two competitors at the same time. I might be wrong. Mars has hired McKinsey despite having lots of MBAs, lots of management scientists. Um, and I don't, I'm sure their corporate lawyers and stuff went through to look at very thick non-disclosures, non-compete clauses. Um, so my guess is it just doesn't happen. They don't take a chance.
Thank you.
Because most companies think that they have, that the way they do things is amazing, or they don't want anybody else to find out. Or we don't want to, this other company might do things better than us. Uh, there might be one or two things we do better than them. We don't want to give that to them. So they're afraid consultants might take that information.
All right. I think. Oh, do we have one more question from Kevin? In addition to how business programs now added ethics classes, what other changes have you noticed within the field over time?
So it's funny, when I left Mars, um, 10 years ago, I thought my MBA was already 15 years old. So that's why I thought, let me look at, the subjects that you learn in an MBA curriculum, get like a book or two on each one, and then study up to see how the teaching of an MBA has changed. And then I found the 10-day MBA. And most of the new stuff in that, a lot of it, would deal with, and it won't even have the latest in supply chain, particularly, technology with the internet, the latest, because that's just developing so fast. And marketing, it's ingrained in marketing, consumer packaged goods. So, large television campaigns, even like a company like Toyota still spends the vast majority of their marketing money on like traditional television and print, and they're spending more and more on social media and the internet, but it's not it's still not more than half. So those are definitely things that you might not even get if you're going to Harvard MBA school right now and taking a marketing class. It might be still more, it's a generalist degree, so you might have to study that yourself. So, but obviously in corporate finance, things changed. Like there were new, um, I was in the school in the 80s when leverage buyouts and mergers and acquisitions were in. This like the .com, they had to start teaching like .com startups and ways to evaluate new companies when you want to go to issue stock. What are the models you use? And then even ultimately, when you looked at the financial crisis, the giant investment banks where their risk departments would basically hire, they'd have a room full of like Harvard and MIT and doctorates in mathematics and quants, they call them, and a room full of crazy computers. And they would say, okay, guys, model where the market's going. Take history and tell us where the market's going. And, these guys aren't business guys, so they're doing what they're told to do. But, in this case, the risk managers um, didn't know enough, or maybe they knew and didn't want to know what the answer was. But to say, let's model based on what's happening now, where the future's going, and what's happening now has never happened before. We never had these financial products that got us in all this trouble by 2007. So the risk people were coming back and said, the MIT doctorates are saying, the models say, double down, keep selling these products. But, it was a bubble, and people just don't want to believe that bubbles are out there. So we're kind of blinded to that. So yeah, it's probably, you want to do a lot of reading afterwards, because just like a doctor doesn't get their degree and stop learning. They got to go to continual classes and attend seminars and stuff to see what the latest technologies are. So you always got to remain current.